You know you should leave. So why does it feel so hard to walk away from a narcissist? Have you ever felt like your mind knows the truth, but your heart refuses to accept it? You see the patterns. You feel the exhaustion. You recognize the emotional instability. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice keeps saying, "This isn't healthy. You need to leave." But when the moment comes to actually walk away, something stops you. Not physically, emotionally. You hesitate. You doubt yourself. You remember the good moments. You question your own judgment. And suddenly, leaving doesn't feel like freedom. Feels like loss. That confusion is not accidental. It is the result of powerful psychological mechanisms that reshape how your brain, your nervous system, and your identity respond to attachment, uncertainty, and emotional reinforcement. And understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward reclaiming your emotional clarity. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani Durvasula often explains that relationships involving narcissistic traits can create what feels like emotional intensity, but underneath that intensity is often inconsistency. And inconsistency, paradoxically, strengthens attachment. Because the human brain does not bond most strongly through constant reward. It bonds through intermittent reward. When warmth, affection, and connection are unpredictable, sometimes present, sometimes withdrawn, the brain releases dopamine in irregular patterns. This creates a reinforcement cycle similar to what behavioral psychology calls variable reward conditioning. In simple terms, your brain learns to keep hoping, not because the relationship is consistently fulfilling, but because it is occasionally fulfilling. Those occasional moments of warmth become neurologically amplified. They stand out. They feel meaningful. They feel like proof of potential. And your brain begins associating emotional endurance with eventual emotional reward. This is one of the deepest reasons walking away feels so hard. Because you are not just leaving a person. You are leaving the hope your brain was trained to anticipate. Psychiatrist David R. Hawkins described how emotional attachment often becomes entangled with identity and internal emotional survival systems. Over time, your role in the relationship becomes part of how you understand yourself. You become the one who stabilizes, the one who understands, the one who forgives, the one who stays. And this identity becomes emotionally meaningful, even when it hurts, because identity provides psychological continuity. It gives your brain a sense of structure. Walking away doesn't just mean losing someone else. It means losing the version of yourself that existed inside that dynamic. And that creates emotional disorientation. There is another layer that makes this even more powerful. Your nervous system adapts to emotional unpredictability. When you experience repeated emotional highs and lows, your autonomic nervous system becomes conditioned to operate in a state of hypervigilance. You become highly sensitive to tone changes, mood shifts, subtle signals of approval or withdrawal. This is not a conscious choice. This is neurological adaptation. Your brain is trying to maintain emotional stability in an unstable environment. Over time, emotional tension becomes normalized. And when you imagine leaving, your nervous system doesn't immediately interpret that as relief. It interprets it as uncertainty. And uncertainty triggers fear. Even when the familiar environment was emotionally painful, it was still predictable. Predictability, even painful predictability, feels safer to the nervous system than the unknown. This is why people often feel anxiety not only when staying, but also when leaving. Darren F. McGee, known for his work on emotional awareness, emphasizes that emotional dependency is not about weakness. It is about conditioning. The brain becomes accustomed to certain emotional rhythms, and breaking those rhythms requires neurological recalibration. In the middle of these dynamics, individuals may encounter patterns commonly described in psychology as narcissistic traits. These traits can include difficulty maintaining consistent empathy, reliance on external validation, and sensitivity to perceived rejection. It's important to understand this in educational terms, not accusatory ones. These traits often reflect deeply rooted psychological defense structures designed to protect fragile internal self-concepts. But regardless of their origin, the emotional impact on the receiving end can be profound. because over time, your emotional focus shifts. You stop asking, "Am I happy?" And you start asking, "How do I keep the peace?" You begin monitoring yourself, adjusting yourself, suppressing yourself, not all at once, but gradually. And the most painful part is that you may not even recognize how much of yourself you've lost until you try to leave. Because leaving requires reconnecting with a version of yourself that hasn't been fully present. And that reconnection can feel unfamiliar, sometimes even frightening. You may question your strength. You may question your memories. You may question whether you are overreacting. This is partly due to a phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when your emotional experience and your logical understanding conflict. Your logic says this is unhealthy. Your emotional conditioning says, but what if it gets better? And your nervous system says this is familiar. Stay where it's familiar. These systems are not working against you. They are trying to protect you based on past conditioning. But healing requires gently retraining these systems. The first step is understanding that emotional attachment is not the same as emotional safety. You can feel deeply attached to someone who is emotionally inconsistent. Attachment reflects familiarity. Safety reflects stability. And stability is what allows your nervous system to finally rest. Dr. Ramani often emphasizes that one of the most important steps in healing is rebuilding self-trust. Because these dynamics often erode your confidence in your own perceptions. You begin relying more on external emotional cues than your own internal emotional truth. Healing reverses that process. You begin listening to yourself again. You begin honoring discomfort instead of dismissing it. You begin recognizing that peace is not something you earn. It is something you allow. Another essential step is creating emotional distance. Not just physical distance, but psychological distance. This means reducing exposure to emotional triggers that reactivate the conditioning cycle. Every interaction can reactivate neural pathways associated with emotional attachment. Distance allows those pathways to weaken, not instantly, but gradually. And during that gradual process, something remarkable begins to happen. Your nervous system stabilizes. Your emotional baseline becomes calmer. Your thoughts become clearer. And you begin seeing the relationship not through the lens of hope, but through the lens of reality. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. You begin recognizing that the difficulty of walking away was never a reflection of your weakness. It was a reflection of your capacity for emotional investment, your capacity for loyalty, your capacity for hope. And those capacities are not flaws. They are strengths. They simply need to be directed toward environments where they are reciprocated consistently, not conditionally, not unpredictably, consistently, and eventually, the emotional gravity that once pulled you back begins to weaken, not because you forced it to, but because your nervous system no longer depends on it for stability. You begin experiencing something unfamiliar, emotional neutrality, and neutrality is where true freedom begins. Because neutrality allows you to make decisions based on clarity, not conditioning. Based on truth, not fear. Based on self-respect, not emotional survival. If this message resonated with you, consider subscribing to this channel. Like this video, and share it with someone who may still be struggling to understand why leaving feels so difficult. And in the comments, if you feel comfortable, share your experience. Your voice may help someone else recognize their own clarity. Because clarity is the first form of freedom. And if you are standing at the edge of a difficult decision right now, torn between what you feel and what you know, remember this, you are not alone.